HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, 3rd edition, by Jeffrey N. Wasserstrom and Maura Elizabeth Cunningham. Read by Joe Barrett. Preface to the 3rd edition. In October 2012, as we finished work on the 2nd edition of this book, we worried about superseding events that might occur between the time we signed off on the proofs and the time the first copies hit bookshelves. Our concern focused, naturally enough, on the book's final questions and answers in the chapter titled The Future that closes the volume. As historians, we are always leery about veering, even cautiously, into the realm of prediction, but we had a more specific reason to feel uneasy. A once-in-a-decade leadership transition was about to take place in Beijing. In November 2012, Hu Jintao was scheduled to relinquish his hold on a post he had occupied since November 2002, that of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. He was expected to follow that up early in 2013 by stepping down from being President of the People's Republic of China, PRC, and being replaced as Chairman of the Central Military Commission. We were fairly confident that Hu would not try to retain any of those positions. We also felt pretty certain that Xi Jinping, long Hu's designated heir apparent, would take on all three of the vacated posts. Surprising things, however, had been happening in Chinese elite politics during the preceding 2 years. Most notably, the charismatic Ba Xilai had gained popularity. His rise was curtailed by a sensational scandal early in 2012, discussion about which we had included in the book, of course, but it had seemed that Ba might prove a wild card, capable of derailing the long-anticipated smooth passing of the baton from Hu to Xi. Even after Ba's downfall, questions and rumors swirled around the leadership transition, and we hesitated to say definitively that Xi would become China's next paramount leader. Determined to avoid having anything we wrote about the transition proven wrong before the book even shipped, we sought and received permission from Oxford University Press to delay signing off on the 2nd edition's language until Xi's ascent was assured. We were ready to do this as soon as Xi was installed as leader of the CCP and the other members of the new Politburo Standing Committee he would head were announced in November 2012. After he stepped into that role, we felt comfortable saying that the Hu era had ended and the Xi era had begun. We were confident that he would assume the other two positions in due course, and sure enough, he did in March 2013, while the 2nd edition was in production. What we did not foresee, but no one else we can think of did either, was that Xi would add many more titles to create his now very long list of them, eventually becoming, for example, the first CCP leader to be referred to as Commander-in-Chief. Our sense of uncertainty while working on the 2nd edition was nothing, however, compared to what we have experienced revising this edition's section on the future. Working on it throughout 2017 has proved deeply unsettling due to the rush of events on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. Most notably, leaving aside its destabilizing impact on the United States, Donald J. Trump's first year in office as president has altered or called into question many features of the international scene that previously seemed set in stone. China's relations to the United States, the balance of power within East Asia, and even Xi Jinping's stature as a world leader all seem different than they did 12 months ago. Even if our publisher had infinite patience and were willing to wait longer for this manuscript, we are not sure that we could pick a specific time in the near future when the dust will have settled. Nothing feels lasting right now in either the United States or the PRC, and relations between the two countries are similarly in flux, though smoother on the whole than many expected at the time that Trump, who was surprisingly popular in China even when lambasting the country on the campaign trail, was elected. In a number of commentaries published immediately after Trump's victory, analysts predicted that tensions in U.S.-China relations would increase under the new president, who during his campaign had frequently promised a trade war with China and appeared scornful of the role the United States had played for decades in maintaining a geopolitical balance in Pacific regional politics. Trump stoked these anxieties several weeks later when he accepted a congratulatory phone call from Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, breaking a diplomatic script in place since 1979 that dictated no direct contact between the leaders of the United States and Taiwan. Trump subsequently suggested that the One China policy, long a core principle of U.S.-China relations, should be open to re-evaluation. As 2017 began, the relationship between the United States and the PRC, carefully negotiated and nurtured over the past 4 decades, seemed on the brink of disintegration. That predicted downward spiral has not materialized, in part because Trump has backed away from the most inflammatory elements of his campaign rhetoric and, in public at least, has trumpeted his friendly relationship with and admiration for Xi. Shortly after his inauguration, Trump spoke with Xi and assured him that he had no intention of using the One China policy as a bargaining chip in U.S.-China relations. The two leaders have hosted each other in reciprocal visits that were much watched for signs of conflict, but were ultimately more tepid than tempestuous, notable more for over-the-top symbolic gestures of goodwill than for substance. As a result of several missile tests in mid-2017, North Korea has replaced China as the greatest threat to the United States in Trump's speeches and tweets. U.S.-China relations may not be their strongest at the moment, and could certainly deteriorate at any time, but as we write this preface in mid-November 2017, the situation is stable, if fragile. The current stability is not only due to Trump's retreat from his previous China bashing, but also to Xi's own confidence and strength, both at home and abroad. In the 5 years since he became the PRC's leader, Xi has taken down his political enemies through an aggressive anti-corruption campaign and silenced dissenting voices through a clampdown on civil society. Government propaganda organs have created a cult of personality around him that is unlike anything seen since the days of Mao Zedong in the 1960s and 70s. At the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, not only was Xi given a predicted second term as General Secretary of the CCP, but the party constitution was revised to include a political doctrine named after him, something that had last been done for Deng Xiaoping, and then only posthumously. While making these authoritarian moves domestically, Xi has simultaneously positioned China as a benevolent global leader seeking only to promote peaceful cooperation and development around the world. His signature foreign policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, called One Belt, One Road when it was launched in 2013, provides PRC loans and infrastructure construction knowledge to countries across Eurasia and beyond, creating a regional network of states that are both financially and symbolically indebted to China. In January 2017, Xi became the first top Chinese leader to attend and speak at the Davos World Economic Forum, where his speech celebrated globalization and China's willingness to advance global economic interconnectedness. He followed this up in November 2017 with a similar address at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation (APEC) meeting in Vietnam, again touting the benefits of free trade. At a time when American global leadership is waning, Xi has not hesitated to put China forward as the next leader on the international stage, but one with very different principles and interests. Even though many of his actions, from ratcheting up already stringent controls on the Internet to making life increasingly difficult for foreign non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and many international businesses operating in China, have been those of an economic nationalist, many commentators have given his speeches high marks, welcoming the fact that his rhetoric, praising rather than criticizing globalization, offers such a strong counterpart to what Trump has been saying and tweeting. Other recent events that make it particularly hard to complete a work on China which strives to be current include the flurry of new developments within various parts of the PRC. To cite just one case in point, dealing with Hong Kong's shifting political situation in this edition's section on the future would have been complicated even without Trump's assent. Several worrying events occurred during 2015 and 2016, which flagged the precarious position in which Hong Kong residents who anger the mainland's leaders now find themselves. For example, in late 2015, several booksellers involved in publishing gossipy and lightly sourced works dealing with the private lives of CCP leaders were spirited from Hong Kong, and in one case Thailand, onto the mainland, where some were forced to make televised confessions that were clearly coerced. In 2016, Joshua Wong, the most famous leader of 2014's Umbrella Movement, which naturally gets discussed in some detail in this edition, was blocked from speaking in Thailand, presumably because of pressure that Beijing put on Bangkok. That year, China's central authorities also intervened in legal procedures in Hong Kong's courts to determine whether elected representatives to the local legislative council should be allowed to take their seats or barred from doing so due to symbolic protests they lodged during oath-taking ceremonies. In 2017, disturbing events have continued to raise concerns about the alarming speed with which the gap separating Hong Kong from mainland urban centers is shrinking. To name just two examples, a British politician with deep ties to the city and a tradition of speaking out about human rights issues was barred from entering Hong Kong, and when Beijing passed a law that made showing disrespect to the national anthem punishable by up to 3 years in prison, the authorities emphasized that Hong Kong's government would need to find a way of enforcing a form of this regulation inside the city, where booing the song at sporting events has become a popular way of expressing discontent with current political trends. Too much is happening, and too quickly, for us to assure you that we know where China, or the United States, or U.S.-China relations are heading. But while we have written this edition's The Future chapter with even more uncertainty than we felt while doing the same back in November 2012, we are confident that knowing about China, not only its present but also its recent and even distant past, remains an essential part of being an engaged citizen in the 21st century world. In this book, we offer the historical, political, and cultural background necessary to see the big picture behind the immediacy of daily news stories. We hope this will assist you in understanding the larger context of those stories, whatever the future may bring. To keep up with our thinking on current events, please follow us on Twitter, @JWassers and @Maura Cunningham. Part 1. Historical Legacies. To understand today's China, it is crucial to know something about its past, and especially important for our purposes are those aspects of its history that have direct relevance for contemporary developments, whether because of the precedents they set or because current leaders present themselves as breaking away from them or carrying them forward. With this in mind, and intended to avoid a wearying and confusing march through all the dynasties, the following 3 chapters offer up a selective, but we hope illuminating, quick run-through of the 2 millennia plus that get China from Confucius to Mao. The first chapter introduces early Chinese schools of thought, especially the ideas of Confucius, since today's leaders seek to depict China as a society where Confucian and communist ideals complement one another. It also looks at the place that democratic traditions have had in China, showing that these are not just recent imports from the West. The second chapter focuses on political structures and major political ideas, including the concept of the mandate of heaven, which legitimated imperial rule by asserting a connection between spiritual and earthly dynamics. As well, this chapter examines the similarities and differences in how successive ruling houses, or dynasties, governed China from the 3rd century BCE until 1912, the year that China's last emperor abdicated and a republican form of government was established. Rounding out this first part of the book, Chapter 3, Revolutions and Revolutionaries, looks at the events that transformed the country during the period between 1912 and Mao's death in 1976. It ends with a look at Mao's posthumous legacy, emphasizing the varied ways that the former leader has been perceived in the People's Republic of China, PRC. 1. Schools of Thought. Who was Confucius? Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, was a teacher and philosopher who lived during the Zhou dynasty, 1045 to 256 BCE, in what is known as the Spring and Autumn era, 722 to 476 BCE. As with those of his near contemporary Socrates, none of Confucius's writings have survived, and his views come down to us via a text produced after his death. This is the Analects, which contains short statements attributed to Confucius, the origins of the Confucius Says fortune cookie slips, though these were invented either in Japan in the 1800s or in California in the 1900s, and dialogues between the sage and his disciples. It covers a range of topics, from how a true gentleman behaves in his daily life, right down to how he eats with proper decorum, to how a ruler should govern, with a benevolent concern for the well-being of his subjects. One of its most famous statements, linked to both the high value placed on education in Chinese culture and the meritocratic aspect of the Chinese political tradition, is that people are pretty much alike at birth, but become differentiated via learning. Another well-known adage from the Analects says simply that it is a great pleasure to have friends come to visit from afar. This last adage gained new fame on August 8, 2008, when it was quoted at the start of the Beijing Games. The line had obvious relevance for the Olympic opening ceremony, since the live audience for the grand spectacle held in the Bird's Nest Stadium included foreign leaders, among them George W. Bush, the first sitting American president to attend the Olympics in a foreign country, and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Quoting Confucius also fit with Chinese Olympic publicity efforts generally, which sought to demonstrate that the PRC has become a country that is open to the outside world and respectful of China's ancient traditions and values, while also holding fast to more recent revolutionary ideas. What were Confucius's core ideas? The vision of morality sketched out in the Analects emphasizes the importance of three things: education, ritual, and relationships that are hierarchical yet provide benefits to both superior and inferior parties. Education was important because it was by studying the classical texts that a person could learn about and begin to emulate the actions of the most virtuous figures of past ages, including the legendary sages Yao and Shun, who lived long before the founding of the Zhou dynasty, and figures such as the Duke of Zhou, who lived just a few centuries before Confucius. Ritual, which included a variety of social interactions such as greetings, was important because it was a physical acting out of the best practices of earlier, and to Confucius's way of thinking purer, ages. And relationships, in which there was a clear distinction between higher and lower ranks, were valued, since in these the responsibilities of each side were clear. What was his political vision? Confucius saw political relationships as familial relationships writ large, meaning, for example, that rulers should behave toward those they governed the way that fathers should behave toward their children. He emphasized the importance of four relationships in particular, all of which he saw as reciprocal, and all of which he thought involved analogous combinations of benevolence from one party and deference from the other. These relationships were those of ruler and minister, also formulated as ruler and subject, father and son, elder brother and younger brother, and husband and wife. Later, followers of Confucius added a fifth relationship, more egalitarian than the others, that between friend and friend. In each of the four main dyads discussed by Confucius, the former party was expected to protect the latter, and in return the latter was expected to obey the former. The social order was threatened whenever people failed to act according to their prescribed roles. Confucius lived in a time of civil wars and general instability, which continued during the Warring States era, 475 to 221 BCE, that followed soon after his death. He presented his views as a blueprint that would guarantee that a state would have order within its own borders. He also promised that a ruler who adhered to his teachings would expand the reach of his state, since people living in other kingdoms would flock to such a peaceful, well-governed land. How important was history to Confucius? History was crucially important to Confucius. He claimed that the Western Zhou era, 1046 to 770 BCE, had been a golden age of harmony and enlightened rulers, and called on people to study that age, which he lauded as a time when people knew their proper places within the social order. According to the Analects, the first thing that a true ruler could do to improve the present was to honor the past and revive the rituals and even the music of the Western Zhou as a means to encourage proper deportment. This ruler should also ensure that his own behavior toward his subjects was a model of paternal benevolence at all moments, since this would lead to emulation by all others in a comparably superior position. A land with a good ruler would inevitably be one with good fathers and other lineage elders and good husbands. There was a self-serving side to this argument, for to accomplish these things, Confucius and his followers claimed, it would serve the true king well to rely upon advisers who were thoroughly versed in classical works and had made a specialty of studying the ways of the past. In other words, Confucius and his followers suggested that rulers heed the advice of scholarly specialists in ritual such as themselves. Was Confucius celebrated in his own times? The sage was not particularly successful in gaining followers in his own lifetime. He would occasionally win the ear of a ruler, but never had the opportunity he sought of being a long-term adviser to one. And things did not improve dramatically in the centuries immediately following his death in 749 BCE, though significant refinements of and additions to his thought were made during that time by such figures as Mencius, 372 to 289 BCE, second in importance only to Confucius in the development of what would later become known as Confucianism. The notion that their ideas constituted a clearly defined creed comparable to a Western religion was a much later invention. Up until the end of the Warring States period in the 2nd century BCE, in fact, Confucius's ideas were still but one school of thought, others being Taoism, legalism, and a host of now obscure creeds that were occasionally embraced by one or another ruler of the many competing kingdoms that made up what we now call China. Even when Confucius's teachings took hold, it was often in a diluted form, combined with aspects of competing schools. The proponents of some rival schools of thought, moreover, scoffed at Confucius and his beliefs. He was sometimes mocked by Taoists, who took a more egalitarian view of social relations than did the followers of Confucius and prized spontaneity over rituals. Legalists insisted that rulers should not strive to be admired for their virtues, but rather take steps to ensure that they were respected and feared for the way they distributed rewards and punishments. The Taoists and legalists, though disagreeing with one another on many things, agreed that the emphasis Confucius put on the study of dusty classics was misguided. The former thought it wrong because the golden age they admired was the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE, an era of simplicity that preceded the creation of Zhou texts. The latter, a group of pragmatists, argued that rulers should adapt to the challenges of each new age. As late as 221 BCE, when several of the embattled kingdoms of the Warring States were brought under the control of the head of the kingdom of Qin, it was still far from clear that Confucius would end up the most influential of early philosophers. The founder of the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, who became known to posterity as China's first emperor, had no time for Confucian ideas. He favored the legalists, who told him how to maximize his authority, rather than the scholars who told him how to behave benevolently. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, is now remembered correctly for the terracotta army built to serve him after death, and incorrectly for creating the Great Wall of China. While he did build some large fortifications, the sites tourists visit today, and are described as dating back to Qin Shi Huang's time, actually tend to be remnants of a much later wall-building dynasty, that of the Ming, 1368 to 1644. Yet the legend that Qin Shi Huang created the Great Wall is believable because the legalist ideas he embraced enabled him to summon huge armies of laborers on demand. The few accounts written near the lifetime of the first emperor, all crafted by historians serving the next dynasty, present Qin Shi Huang as a cruel despot. In these works he is described as a model of how not to rule, and as someone so hated by his subjects that the dynasty he had dreamed would go on for centuries was instead overthrown by a popular rebellion that broke out soon after his death, just as his son's reign was beginning. The Qin did leave one enduring legacy, as the dynasty's name helped lead to China being called China, a term that sounds nothing like the primary Chinese terms for the country, such as Zhonghua, meaning Middle Kingdom. As a result of the Qin dynasty's brief hold on power, while one can find traces of legalist influence in the belief systems of many later dynasties, the creed was almost never officially endorsed after the Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, was founded. When did the ideas of Confucius gain influence? It was not until the Qin dynasty had fallen and the Han dynasty established that the ideas of Confucius became a core part of official ideology. And even then Confucianism was combined with elements drawn from other schools of thought, such as Taoism and the yin-yang line of cosmological thinking, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of things that seem clearly different or even opposite. It was sometimes regarded as simply a part of the Taoist creed, but was at other times viewed as its own school of thought. Confucian ideals and practices were extolled by most successive dynasties, though they were often, as in the Han period, braided together with the concepts and rituals taken from other creeds. These included Taoism, always a presence, and Chinese folk religious traditions. In addition, Confucianism was eventually influenced greatly by ideas associated with the imported but quickly domesticated belief system of Buddhism, which reached an early point of high influence in China during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, a cosmopolitan era when many ideas and objects flowed in through overland trade routes such as the Silk Road. Buddhist concepts were crucial in contributing to modifications within the Confucian tradition during the Sung Dynasty, 960 to 1279, that were so significant that the term Neo-Confucianism is used to describe them. What was the status of Confucianism to 1949? From the Han Dynasty onward, Confucian ideas remained central to Chinese political practices, regardless of which dynasty was in power, until a dramatic dip in Confucius's fortunes came in the early 1900s. Many Chinese intellectuals of the time argued that an attachment to Confucian values was responsible for the country's decline. They blamed Confucius for China's position of backwardness vis-à-vis the West and Japan, a formerly Confucian country that had begun to embrace European and American ways in the mid-19th century. The most disruptive pre-1949 anti-Confucian upsurge occurred during the New Culture movement, which began in 1915 and lasted until the mid-1920s. This was an iconoclastic struggle that one leader, Hu Shi, 1891 to 1962, a student of the American philosopher John Dewey, would describe as the Chinese Renaissance in a book by that title based on lectures he gave in Chicago in the 1930s. The Chinese Renaissance also had things in common with the Enlightenment, its radical questioning of tradition and prizing of rationality, and the Western counterculture movement of the 1960s, its extolling the value of youth, for example, and its celebration of new forms of art and literature. Participants in the New Culture movement, including a young Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, and the great Chinese writer Zhou Shuren, 1881 to 1936, who published under the pen name Lu Xun, wrote scathingly about how Confucius had shaped a China in which age was venerated at the expense of youth, women were repressed, individualism and creativity were stifled, and a cult of tradition prevented innovation. To join the modern world, they argued, China needed to jettison Confucius and everything he represented, embracing the best that the West had to offer, as Japan had done, resulting in its rise in global influence. They also insisted that intellectuals stop using classical Chinese, which was far removed from vernacular forms of communication, and develop a plain speech, baihua, form of writing to take its place. Some New Culture veterans would stick to anti-Confucian positions for decades. Others would eventually abandon them, throwing their lot in with the Nationalist Party, which began as a radical revolutionary group, but later became a conservative political organization. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, Zhang Jie-shi, 1887 to 1975, the nationalists of the 1930s would in fact be responsible for a major Confucian revival. Chiang insisted that China's best route forward was to find a way to combine Confucian values with the most advanced technologies and best ideas coming from Japan and the West. Despite being a Christian, Chiang elevated the Chinese sage's birthday to the status of a state holiday. He argued that the emphasis on tradition, family, social order, and clearly delineated hierarchies in Confucianism could go hand in hand with the teachings of the Bible. Is Confucianism a religion? Confucius himself was more of a philosophical than a religious figure. Even though his emphasis on looking up to elders fit in well with the practices of ancestor worship, which predated his time and remained a mainstay of Chinese tradition, his teachings offered no details about an afterlife. Nevertheless, throughout Chinese history, he has occasionally been elevated to a saint-like status, with temples being devoted to him, including some that have recently been spruced up by the government, and his Shandong province hometown of Chifu being transformed into a pilgrimage site, with lately a bit of a theme park aspect thrown in. Ironically, the period of rule by the Christian Chiang Kai-shek was a time in which Confucius was revered, as is the current era of rule by the allegedly atheist Communist Party. Many non-Chinese have argued that the country has three major religions: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Though Confucianism is more a philosophy than a religion, Taoism and Buddhism are indeed important systems of belief in China. Yet religious identity is more fluid than in the Judeo-Christian West, as many Chinese will move, sometimes unconsciously, among the three practices, depending on context. Someone, for example, might worship at a Confucian temple right before an important school exam, due to the sage's association with learning, but also consider him or herself a practicing Buddhist.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?